So there were certainly periods of a lot of doubts and a lot of confusion, and I would try to get those answered, like go to a youth group retreat, and then I'd pull up whatever youth pastor that was speaking at the retreat, aside, and then I would pepper him with like questions, like what is this, what is that, and then looking back now, it's like silly because a youth pastor was probably some 21-year-old kid.
Hey, welcome to Set Your Talks Ablaze. My name is Andrew Park, and I have a really special guest with me here today. He's been a role model for most of my life. He's an amazing husband to his wife, a leader, servant in his community, and a God-fearing man, and honestly one of the hardest working people I know. And so happens that he's my older brother. So I'm super happy to have you here today. How you doing, big bro? Just introduce yourself a little bit. Tell us who you are, what you do, and yeah, let's dive right in.
Thank you. My name is Nate Park, Andrew's older brother. My Korean name is Hyungwoo, so some people know me as Hyungwoo or Nate. I live in Northern Virginia. I've been living in Virginia since I was 10 years old, and yeah, just a normal lay guy who works in the DC area, and love going to church and hanging out with friends and just doing normal things, So, but yeah, so just excited to talk about all this stuff. I don't know that I've been the big role model that you speak of, but I'm glad that you feel that way. But yeah, I'm really excited to talk to you today, and let's see how this goes.
Yeah, that's awesome. Yeah, thank you for that. Yeah, he's seeming like he's a little bit humble about all of his stuff. Like he is a big role model to me. I mean, you are, for real. I know we've had a lot of differences in the past and stuff like that when, I was growing up, and we were both, a lot of differences, but I think we've come past a lot of it and come together into a really, good relationship. Being 5 years apart is obviously a little different for siblings. Most of them are a little bit closer in years, so they have more of that friendship bond, where we had more of a kind of father-son bond type aspect for a long time. But yeah, no, I guess just diving right into it for real, like, we both grew up in a Christian family, so we had a lot of these values embedded within us from an early age, but ultimately that isn't what really makes a Christian. It's ultimately about the personal relationship, the intimate relationship that you form with God, with Jesus. And that's the important part, where I left the church for, about 10 years of my life. Although I didn't really denounce God or anything like that, I just walked away from the faith, and my outward life reflected none of it, whereas you held on to that faith. And honestly, I just wanted to ask, like, what made God such a big focus in your life? Why Jesus? Kind of walk me through that journey of faith.
Yeah. I think one thing to kind of keep in mind is this is a long journey, and our lives are not over yet, obviously. So there's struggles that we've had, and there's going to be struggles that we are going to have. And the hope is that at the end of the day, as one of my favorite pastor, John Piper, once upon a time said, the goal is whether we crawl there or we're running there, we cross the finish line, and we want to hear God say, "My good and faithful servant." So, but yeah, I think just going back to maybe how my church life kind of began, you have to maybe go back to before the time in America when I was a little kid in Korea. And so I lived in Korea from when I was born to when I was 10 years old. And just coincidentally, I moved to this place called Incheon when I was 2 years old. And in Korea, it's a small country, so there's a lot of skyscraper, apartment, condo type of housing everywhere. So we lived in one of those condo complexes, and right literally perpendicular to our house was a shopping center. On the bottom of the floor was one of the grocery stores that we used to go to a lot. And then on the first floor was like a Chinese restaurant. And second floor was, I don't know, some other stuff. And then on the third floor was our church, the church plant that mom and dad started going to when I was basically, like two years old. So every, church event, all the small community that we had, I grew up with church as sort of an integral part of my life, and in a way that is probably a little hard to imagine now, because in America we have such a long distance between neighborhoods, right, and the church. But it was like literally next door. So obviously, God was gracious and He planted something in me at an early age, and made, for some reason, even as like a young kid, just me be aware of this idea and this concept, this truth of sin, and that I needed a savior, I need a redeemer. So yeah, I think that was sort of how it began. And just like any childhood, I think overall we had a good childhood, but there's a lot of stuff that happens, when you're born to when you get out of high school, and our lives were no different. So, I think even in the midst of all the chaotic stuff at home, I had somewhere to go to, like literally next door. So, if mom and dad got into an argument or something, in America we had to like stay in our house, but I could literally walk out even as a young kid and just go to like a sanctuary, and sit there just kind of, lost in my thoughts, or praying, or maybe reading the Bible. So, yeah, so I feel like God just kind of orchestrated something special, and that was outside of, what I had anything to do with, to make church be a very foundational part of my life. So I think even as I was struggling with things in high school, college, and post-college, there was something that was gripping me to lay down whatever the issues are. And yeah, so I don't know, it was I guess kind of a unique, but probably not that uncommon, to be honest, for a kid who kind of immigrated around the time I did, if they grew up in church.
Yeah, I mean, like, no, I get exactly what you mean, like, but I think there's an interesting part that you said, like how God made it such a foundational aspect of your life, and in a unique way, because like I said, like we both grew up in that Christian household, and we went through very, similar experiences in terms of the struggles of the doubt of faith or whatever like that. But the big difference between us is that I kind of walked away from it, and I'm curious, like, what kept you in that faith? Like, what kept you on that path?
Yeah. I mean, I think just like any aspect of faith, really at the root of it, it's a gift from God. So I think there's a less of really what I did or whatever my surrounding is. It's just been His kindness. But then, it doesn't mean that, I think, just because you have a period of waywardness that is visible, that is the lesser of a blessing, right? There's a story that's unfolding, and God willing, we have 40, 50 years left in our lives, and who knows, where we're going to be at. But so far, He's been very just kind of merciful in that sense. But if I were to maybe just kind of like contextualize it into sort of how I can process it, maybe the external things, or I think maybe like one sort of a early childhood difference is that, and kind of going back to the early parts of like Korea, like church wasn't just like a part of my life. It was like literally like my life. I felt like I had more of a root in like our church family than like our own family. So like we had our aunts and we had our uncles and we had our cousins, but it was like the church, aunts and church uncles that I was closer to, and I saw them more often. And when I was in elementary school, like they had a children choir, like with 4 rows of kids, singing songs every Sunday, and attending Sunday school was not a just after school activity. It was like literally the thing that I look forward to. So I think just it was really kind of embedded. And then also I think that was a period where mom was the most involved with church and probably the most like passionate, So I think obviously that had a factor. And she was like, in terms of time and commitment that she could offer, it was just one of those periods where she had most accessibility to that. And so I think that certainly played a factor. And whereas I think you grew up here in America where you kind of, 5 years is a short time, like in Korea, right? So a lot of your formidable years were in Richmond, where, it was like we're in Chester and our church is in Richmond, and then we're seeing them maybe like once a week, So it was probably a little bit more of a regular church experience, versus I feel like back in the day, like when I was in Korea, it was like literally every single day, like the church was like the place, So, so I think it was a blessing in that sense. But I mean, by no means, like it doesn't mean that I didn't struggle. Like I remember in high school, I really had a hard time with this idea of like election, like predestination, God's sovereignty, why do bad things happen to people, and why did God, allow sin? What is the meaning of original sin? Why are things the way they are? And of course, a lot of the angst that I felt, like during my teenage years. And so there were certainly periods of a lot of doubts and a lot of confusion. And I would try to get those answered, like go to a youth group retreat, and then I'd pull up whatever youth pastor that was speaking at the retreat, aside, and then I would just pepper him with like questions, It's like, what is this? What is that? And then looking back now, it's like silly because, that youth pastor was probably some 21-year-old kid who was a first-year seminary student, doesn't really know a lot, but, he's trying to sort of exude this wisdom and almost like a sense of omniscience, so this kid is not confused or discouraged. And, but yeah, I don't know. It's just like, just kept on pursuing. And even today, it's the same thing. I get discouraged. I get confused. I get wayward, in my ways. I get fed up with certain things. I get fed up with people, my circumstances, and bemoan the fact that things are the way they are. But then somehow, some way, it's just through all the different forces, God just kind of reels me back in. So that's sort of been like, honestly, like the story, of my life. Like beneath, the surface behind the curtains, things that you don't see on a day-to-day basis is a lot of like ugly stuff, but it's like that persistent coming back again, knowing that I'm like that younger son, from time to time, who is just, whoring after the wrong things, just in a filth, but having somehow, some way, the wherewithal to come back. And I think that's been probably the biggest blessing so far. So I don't know if I answered your question, but
no, that's honestly like what you described. I feel like so many people kind of go through this experience. It's that, when we kind of often think about what being a Christian is this like person that has their life together, is, going to church, and they like might not necessarily know every single doctrine or part of scripture or the Bible or whatever, but it's that they're actually living out their life in a very kind of righteous manner or whatever. But like to be completely honest, is that I think a lot, if not most Christians today, like they struggle in many different ways in their personal lives. There's a lot of different things that, me personally too, is just when I came really back to the faith and I started to realize like what it meant to surrender yourself to God, what it meant to actually say, hey, God, like I'm trusting you with everything that I have, and it has nothing to do with me. And that aspect of surrender is super hard in today's society specifically. It was a little bit more cohesive when we were younger, because there was still a level of kind of we grew up in a Korean traditional type, deal. So we understood the hierarchical aspect a little bit better. Like there's a difference between America and Koreans in that aspect, but it's knowing that doesn't matter. You know what I mean? It's really about understanding that the gift of grace that God gave to us, that salvation, and it's nothing that we do. It's just because he died for us while we were still sinning, while we were dead in our trespasses. That's what gives us that grace. And if we are going to accept and embrace it, it's kind of like, oh, this has nothing to do with me, but thank you, God, like for allowing me to have this second chance. And being reborn, dying to yourself, being reborn in Christ, like every single day. Like that's like the beautiful thing about God to me these days. It's that it's not what we should do for the salvation. It's that because of what he did, this is what we ought to do. And maybe like the wording, I'm not saying it quite right, but I think that struggle is a very real thing. And we often look at ourselves as like, oh, because I'm not acting a certain way, because I look like I am a good person to others, but in reality, I am a dirty, dirty sinner, but ultimately, like, I think understanding that is a very, very good thing, because it's about understanding that so many of the different sins that we never really thought about before, like, this is okay. Like that, this action's kind of good. Like these small little compromises we make about our faith and being like, as long as I'm, going to church every week, reading the Bible every day, then God's got me. But it's just that I don't think that's true. You know what I mean? So yeah. It's really about just having that undying faith. And that's why I say you're a role model to me, is because you went through so many of the different struggles, but you're able to kind of maintain that and be willing to be like, there's a lot of stuff I don't understand. I want to question it, but at the same time, I'm not going to walk away from this, so.
Yeah. I mean, I think, I was actually reading a book that this person from college wrote recently, and haven't finished it yet, but it seems like a really, really good book. But in the book, there's this one anecdote that she talks about when she became a Christian around like 11 years old. And she mentions how, looking back, being saved, she didn't understand any of what that really means, much like a newborn child understanding what birth is, right? So a lot of times, like, we'll talk in Christian circles, and during testimonies or whatever, people will ask this question like, well, tell me about how you got saved. And it's a kind of a silly question in some sense, because it's kind of like asking, how were you born? Well, you were born in a hospital, you came from your mom's tummy, and the details are probably a little too excruciatingly inappropriate to discuss, but it's about the same thing, right? And I think most people who are saved are probably from the same camp. It could look different. It might be a different hospital. It might be a different timing. Who gave you birth? Well, it's your mom. So in the salvation context, like God gives you a new life, a new hope, and just kind of understanding that it really is a gift, while kind of like holding that truth, holding this other truth that we are somehow, for some reason, responsible for our sins. So, and God promises us to take us from like one glory to the next when we are in Him. So there's the process of like sanctification, that we should see, and when we don't see that, it's painful. And it's, like the other day, like I got kind of angry, because it's been an overwhelming week, and I was angry with something, and I acted very angry and very foolishly, to June, was my wife, and I sat down and I was thinking about it, And usually it's like, the nighttime when I'm tired and when I'm cranky, that I act very foolish. And then in the morning when I wake up and I'm a little bit more sober-minded, I see like June like sleeping and, it just comes to my mind, this like sort of this shame and this sorrow for not treating her nearly as well as I promised her, and but she gives me grace the next day, when I apologize, and God is like that on a whole new different level, and June's a nicer person than I am, so obviously sometimes I'm gonna act foolish relative, but God is like perfect in every way, so of course, like compared to the perfect standard, and I'm gonna come short, and I don't quite understand, the mystery of how this thing will play out. And I've seen a lot of people come and go, but yeah, like I'm just hoping, that all these things will be answered, when we eventually see him face to face. So, yeah.
Yeah, no, that's awesome. Like, and it's actually very interesting that you share that story, because I had a very similar experience with my wife Jasmine, and yeah, it's kind of goes to show you that we actually definitely are siblings, similar temperaments, and we definitely have really great wives that show us that grace. And one thing that, from my perspective, what happened is, I'm acting foolish, and then, I go downstairs and I'm like, all right, I'm going to be prepping for this interview when, and then, I picked up the Bible to try to start, prepping. I'm like, all right, like, I'm going to start getting ready for this. And then all of a sudden it hit me. I'm like, all right, like, what am I doing? Like, I said that I'm going to start this podcast because I want to glorify God. I want to share the message of Christ. And yet I left my wife in a terrible state to come downstairs to be like, I'm going to do something to glorify God. And that's when it really dawned on me. I'm like, wait, how selfish am I? Like, yeah. This is me all of a sudden taking something that I said that I'm going to surrender myself to the Creator for, and then I'm making it about myself. Like, oh, I need to prepare. So this is what I need to do. And it like, when we were going through some of the prior, notes for the discussion, you noted Jehovah Jireh. And when I first...
Jehovah Jireh.
Jehovah Jireh, yeah. So I didn't know if I was pronouncing not right, but so I actually had no idea what Jireh meant, so I had to look it up on Google, and it's Hebrew for the Lord will provide. And it was awesome that you mentioned that, because it was essentially like we treat our lives in so many different ways of like, what can God do for me if I act or do XYZ, then I feel that the Lord should do this for me, and like, that's when it really starts getting distorted, because it's ultimately about not what we want. It's about what we actually need in our life. And what I wanted to do yesterday was prepare for this interview and do all this stuff and make sure that I sounded good, or I had everything prepared and all this stuff. But what I really needed to do was make sure that I went upstairs, apologized to my wife, and did what I was supposed to do as a husband. And it's amazing that when I pick up the Bible, that's when that thought dawned on me, where it's like, oh, yeah, thank you, God, for that humility. I really needed that, because this is where we fall short the most, you know what I mean? And yeah, so no, I thought you hit the nail on that. And that's not saying the Lord will provide, it's from Genesis, where Abraham is told to take Isaac to the mountain to sacrifice him as a burnt offering. So, it's kind of like where that test of your faith really comes into play. Because I'm sure, Isaac's going up the mountain with his father, and he's like, hey, Dad, where's the offering? And Abraham's like, yeah, God will provide the sheep. But then, they get up to it, he ties them down. But I don't think Isaac was like, yeah, go ahead, Dad. Like, I'm ready for it. He's probably like, yeah. What are you doing right now? Like, and I can't even imagine the turmoil that Abraham's going through, like what's going on in his mind. It's not like he's just such a lunatic for God that he's just like, yeah, I'll kill my son for you, God, anytime you say. Like, I'm sure he's going through some massive struggles, but that willingness to trust in the Lord, to understand that God has a purpose for this. God has a reason for asking me to do this. And that faithfulness is when he's about to plunge that knife, and then the angel comes and he's like, hey, don't lay a hand on him. God's seen your faithfulness. And so that's like such a beautiful thing about that. So it's just like, the Lord will provide.
Yeah, no, for sure. And I think it really is a blessing to be a little bit incompetent, because it helps you to acknowledge that there are limitations to what you can do, that you need help. And I don't know, like I'm not like the most humble person, or I don't think I'm like just the most incompetent person in the world. Maybe it's like part of some childhood issues or whatever, but I think I knew deep inside that there is like a limitation to this thing, that there's a limited capacity to understand, that I can't unlock every box in this world, and that I need help. So there's a couple of things that that God has been just kind of hammering in my life over the past 10 years, and one is like we talk about the Christian faith as like an unconditional gift from God, and it is in one sense, because while we were still sinners, God came and then he died right on the cross, and he gives salvation without any condition, and even the act of belief is a gift from God. So everything is like the will and the act of God that initiates the entire process. But in the Bible it says like God provides grace to the humble. So like humility is a prerequisite. That's the one thing that we say in our church a lot. Humility is a prerequisite for God's grace. The more humble you are, the more grace you experience. And when things are just going fantastic in your life, it's hard to experience that, and it's hard to know that you need a provider until you're actually in need, So again, this is not to like sort of minimize other people's problems or to make an example out of suffering, or to not be empathetic, but I think sometimes things happen in our lives, and it's still a mystery, because God certainly does not want us to be in pain, I don't think. But through the suffering and pain that he ordains, there's this yearning that grows, for his help. And whether it's like, getting sick, or, just things not panning out exactly the way we planned, in our lives. My life certainly does not look exactly the way I imagined it would be. In some sense, it's great that it didn't happen, because I had a very small imagination when I was a kid, and or just like even things at home, things that are tough with our parents' health, to like the typical family dynamics that we are not exempt from. It's like a free gift, It's like, this is why you need, and then when we reflect back on our 35 to 40 years, of our lives, I think it's very evident, that God's been very gracious, So it's like important to remember all of that, but it's hard though, It's really hard,
right? Yeah.
When you're stuck. So
to your point, I think that one of the biggest arguments against the belief in God for a lot of people is that concept of suffering. If God exists, then why does he allow like certain things to happen? And I don't know all of the philosophical arguments for all of that stuff, so I'm not really trying to dive too deep into it. But at the same time, I feel that there are some times that we don't truly understand like what the point of the suffering is, and there is value in it. And I'm not saying that all suffering is equal or that you need to go through it. Like there are some tragedies that even I struggle with where I'm like, dang, like why did that have to happen? And it's really hard to reconcile in my own mind. And I think that's a part where when we try to reason out and logically kind of define who God is, why would he do this and this, when we ultimately, if we have a faith in God, we realize that we cannot comprehend him. And while he can give us understanding and wisdom in many different ways, that's the wisdom that he's going to give to us according to his will and his purpose. And there are so many times when we go through suffering that we end up coming out the other side a lot stronger with much more values and lessons that are learned from it. But ultimately, I think another big thing about the idea of suffering is that, when we say we love God, and it's like we love ourselves, like the 2 great commandments, love the Lord your God, all your heart, all your mind, your soul, love your neighbor as yourself. But it's pretty easy to say you love God and you love others when life is going great. It's like, oh yeah, blessings pour onto me, my cup overfloweth, like praise the Lord, and it's pretty easy to do that. But are you able to go to God and still praise him? Are you able to give him the adoration, the reverence that he still deserves, even amidst the suffering, even amidst things in your life where you're like, why is this happening to me? But then are still able to go, God, I trust you. I know you have a purpose for this. Kind of like the story with Abraham where he's like, I'm sure that's not something he wanted to do. Well, I really hope he didn't, So it's just like, why are you putting me through this? But at the same time, like, I trust you and I know you have a purpose for this. Like even Jesus in his human form, in the garden of, I can't pronounce that word, but where he's praying and, he's bleeding out of his pores because of how stressed he is. And he even asked God then, he's like, hey, if it's something that I don't need to go through, like take this burden away from me. But then he says, but if it's your will, like, like this is your will and I'm willing to go through it all. And I think that's the true essence of like having that faith and having that belief is like, if you're unwilling to give God what he deserves amidst all circumstances. I think it's Paul that writes that famous verse that everybody loves to quote, like, I can do all things through Christ who strengthens me. But then there's a part before that. It's about through abundance, through wealth. I can be poor, I can be sick, but amidst all of that, I can endure all of that because Christ will give me strength. So, I feel like that verse is a little misinterpreted sometimes where it's just kind of I can do anything because Christ is with me. It's more like, no, like anything that happens to me in life is something that I can endure because Christ is with me. And just like you said, like that humility aspect is where we can truly kind of receive that grace, because as soon as that pride comes into our hearts, because that's something that I struggle with all the time, where I start to be like, yeah, I'm something. And then I'm like, wait a second. And then God does something and humbles me real quick. And those are the times in my life I'm the most grateful, because it's just like, thank you, God, for making me realize once again that this is not about me. This is about you. So, like, yeah.
Yeah, I think when you step back and kind of ask yourself, well, what exactly is this thing that I'm trying to do? Like going back to the first principles of things, and because life gets so busy and that there's so many things that are happening in our day-to-day lives that it's really easy to get myopic views on the thing that we're trying to do today. So I think, the key thing that is just really important is to remember that this thing that we're experiencing now, it's is not our true home, you know. And I think in every sense, if this is like the true home that we belong to, then I think every argument for why we should maximize this life and anything that comes in the way of us maximizing this life should be seen as a negative. But if there is something else, and if this is merely a preparation to get ready for the real thing, even though our minds and our hearts and our eyes and our ability to comprehend, you know, can't really figure that thing out. But I think every Christian who like really loves God knows this feeling of this angstiness and the notion that something about this is not like all that's meant for us, you know. And I think I mentioned the friend earlier that from school who wrote a book. Her book title is like called this homeward ache. Speaking of words that I can't pronounce, there's this German word that she talks about. Apparently she learned from C.S. Lewis, and it's this like feeling of like this hard to describe feeling of like yearning, deep yearning for something that you can't like really touch. And she talks about how as a young child, you know, like a 5-year-old, she had that feeling. And I think the book I'm reading now, but as it unpacks, I think the book is talking about that, you know, just how God is like revealing and giving name to this feeling that she has of longing for the real thing. And so I think suffering in isolation or suffering in the context of this world just straight up sucks, you know. I mean, cancer is terrible, and being depressed or being upset or being lonely or being poor, these are not good things in isolation. But if it's to prepare you for having a desire for something greater than worldly possession, right, or even health or longevity in this life, then everything, if viewed in that context, then, you know, it's possible to imagine that there's a higher purpose, you know. And also kind of going back to the humility, I think a lot of times, like, I've heard people try to explain things away, but at least for me, where I'm at right now, like, I don't understand, you know, like a lot of things. I don't understand why certain things have to happen the way they do. I don't like it a lot of times. But it's just kind of like when you're a little kid and your mom and dad do something and you're like, I don't get it. But you just kind of follow in faith because there's nothing else that you can do. And that answer might not be pleasant for some people because, you know, it's outside of their control and it seems like a cop-out answer maybe. But at least for me, that's like the real thing, you know. So I don't know where else to turn to. So I turn to God, you know. And I think that's a wonderful thing. So, yeah.
Yeah, no, I hear you. That's like the humility aspect, I think, is something that is really so hard to really grasp because people go like, oh yeah, I think I'm pretty humble. And you know, the one thing that I really learned recently, honestly, over 30 years old now, and this is something that I'm coming to realize probably within like the last year or so, but I always thought I was humble in a lot of different ways, which if you think you're humble, you're probably not very humble. So that's the first thing I learned. And the second thing I learned is that there's a difference between being humble and being honest with yourself and being honest about certain things. So like, for example, you know, somebody gives me a compliment on, you know, I've been playing drums since I was 10 years old. And every time somebody used to compliment me on drums, I thought I was being humble by being like, nah, I'm not that good, you know. But there's a difference when you're actually truly being humble. There, you know, if I'm going like, yeah, like, thank you, I've been working really hard for this, but there are definitely people who are much better than me. That's being honest. But when you kind of just go, nah, I'm not that good, you know, and like, you're really just lying, you know, and that's something that you shouldn't be doing either. And there's a lot of stuff in life, I feel like, where we try to maintain some sense of humility about ourselves and be like, oh, I can't take the credit. Not saying you're taking the credit, because all credit and glory goes to God, but it's about just being able to be like, hey, thank you. Like, take the compliment or take an accomplishment or an accolade that you've worked really hard for, and be able to accept that, hey, like, God allowed me to get this, and God allowed me to have this opportunity. So I'm going to bless God with this and say thank you to God. But at the same time, I'm not going to sit here and just be like, oh yeah, like, nah, like I don't, this is not something that I deserve. You know what I mean? Because ultimately, I think that's another distinction that a lot of people make in their lives, where it's just, there's a difference between humility and just that fake humility aspect.
Sure. Yeah, no, I totally hear you. And I think a lot of it comes from sort of a cultural stuff. And again, like, the thing that makes faith different than other aspects of our lives is when it comes to human interaction, you're interacting based on what is visible, in the external world. Like, I can't read your thoughts. I can assume, I can guess, I can kind of presume based on like our history or who I think you are. But the reality is, I can't possibly understand the depth of your thoughts and the things that go through your mind, but when it comes to God, He knows everything. He knows our most inner thoughts, and He knows everything that we have thought, that we're thinking about now, to the thoughts that we will have in the future. So that makes the outward behaviors totally irrelevant unless there's something internal that is actually supporting that external action, right? So humility comes from, it's kind of like knowing your place. I don't know if you've heard of this thing called Dunning-Kruger Effect. Have you ever seen it?
No.
It's like a psychology thing. It's basically like a little curve, and on the y-axis there's a confidence, your confidence level as an individual, and on the x-axis it's a competence, so how skilled you actually are. And it has this like a really steep curve, and then it goes down, and it goes slowly up, so it's a very high peak and then come down quickly and then slow. So they call it this Dunning-Kruger effect, this idea of describing how people typically are when it comes to their learning of a new thing, or when they dive into a new topic or new skill. When they are starting out, they obviously do not feel confident at all. But when they get to know a little bit, they see the iceberg, but they don't see what's underneath the water, Their confidence like goes up through the roof. And they call that Mount Stupid, It's like the peak of stupidity.
Right.
And then as you get to know more, it slopes down again, and then they call the valley of despair, because you realize that, I don't know anything, I thought I knew, but I don't know anything, and they call it the enlightenment, when you grow steadily with time, with confidence going up and your competence going up concurrently. And it's like when you don't know, you don't understand like what really great means. You have this like sense of arrogance, So I think it's like when you see God, it's like impossible not to be humble, because you see all of His glory, you see all of His perfection, you see who He is, And another thing that we talk about at our church a lot is one of our elders, Henry. He loves the book of Exodus, and in Exodus 34, the scene where Moses goes up to Mount Sinai and he's asking God to show him His glory, and God says that He's gonna show him his backside, because if He shows him all of His visible form, then he'll just die. He'll
Right.
crumble and die. And keep in mind that this is like after Moses took Israelites out of Egypt, and he performed all those miracles. He split the sea, and the manna fell out of heaven. There's all these crazy stuff happened. And then when he asked God to show him his glory, God speaks, and then he proclaims certain things, and he proclaims his attributes and his character. And it's like, God is like patient. God is steadfast love, slow to anger. So, out of all the things that God wants us to emulate, these are the characteristics that he wants us to emulate. Like, we're not going to be omniscient. We're not going to be all powerful. We're not going to be able to speak, things into existence, Obviously, we have some of those abilities, right? Like, people create music. You're very talented. Some people are very gifted at programming. They can make things, think things into existence. Or some people are good at physics. They look at nature and they look at how things move, and they can explain that in like a simple formula. And like, I used to admire a lot of those things, when people are excellent at those things. But the reality is actually, God, when he speaks about his glory, he talks about different attributes. He didn't say, go and become a great programmer. He didn't say, go and become a great drummer or a great musician, be an incredibly skilled person, go and cure cancer. He didn't say any of that stuff. But he calls us to be loving, kind, slow to anger, so I think, just kind of like thinking about the end game, like what the purpose is, what it exactly is that he's asking us to do in this life can be a good sort of a barometer, or just a check, a good compass on how we're navigating through life, because every day's so busy and tough, and it's it's stressful, and people are gonna piss you off, and
like everything you're talking about, it's so hard, honestly, to really keep God at, like, when we're talking about God in like a setting like this, it's like, yeah, we can talk about all the greatness of God and his glory and all that stuff, but then like we go out into the world, and I think that's why it's so important to have that community of believers that you can have that foundation with. But then, we're not with them every single day. We're not with them all the time. We have to go out amongst just everybody else. And then, that's when the temptations, desires, and all these other things of the world come into play. And it's when we lose sight of all of that, what God says for us, how to live, that's when it's so easy to become wayward, and I think, like everything you're saying is true. Like, it's so important to keep those attributes that God told us to have. It's not about what talents necessarily do we have and what can we do with them, but it's how do we apply the attributes that God, tells us to live by, and how do we apply those into the things that we have talents for. And so speaking of talents and stuff like that, like, music, we got into all of this stuff. Like, one of the things that I think is one of my most memorable experiences with us in terms of like the sibling aspect is when we used to play in praise band together. But for real, like, I kind of wanted to get a little bit more, I'm curious about what exactly got you into the worship ministry. Like, what led you to continue leading worship, and how does that incorporate into your life today? And I just want to know a little bit more about that.
I mean, I don't know that it's like a part of my permanent identity, but I think at an early age, there's been something that I've been attracted to when it comes to how music stirs up a certain kind of emotion and affection, and so I probably started when I was a kid. Like I told you that in Korea we had this like children choir.
Mhm.
So it was not a big church, but we had all these children's program, and now I think that church is a kind of not a mega church, but I think they have like several thousand people. But when we were going there, it was a new church plant. So, but in a short amount of time, like it attracted a lot of people, and so the children's ministry was like very robust, and so we had this choir, and one of our family friend was like a choir director. So yeah, just enjoyed it. That was a sort of part of the church life there. And I think when we came to America, like largely because you're new and you don't speak the language, and like I think part of church kids' involvement is really with a lot of the activities kind of like forced upon by parents. And when we came here, mom and dad were obviously involved with church, but it's not like they were like influencing us to be at the forefront of whatever sort of a youth group activity. So I didn't really have a ton of like worship leading stuff when I was in youth group. I played a little bit of bass purely out of like necessity, and and when you're in youth group, you're just playing music because you like it, and you try to be all serious, and again, like I think I understood the weight of everything, but what do you know when you're like 14, 15 years old, and so that, and then I went to college, and went to this Christian fellowship when I was in school, and they had a kind of a selective process where the praise team members would, and it's kind of funny now, but even in silly processes, I think God shows a lot of grace, and so it was kind of like one of those. The praise team members would pray, think about people, and then they would have to like unanimously vote. So you have to be like spiritual enough, or so obviously they didn't select me for many years, because and I heard later on that like I would get brought up, and then it would not be unanimous because I was kind of a punk when I was in school, and I still am, but yeah, like fourth year, I got asked to join the team, and even in like the fellowship, played bass or just a little bit of leading worship, but I never like really enjoyed the process all that much because I think one thing that I maybe have inherited from maybe like our dad is I think for whatever good qualities and bad qualities, one thing that is a very strong characteristic in him is I think he's very like earnest, so I think I have that sort of similar earnestness too. So the thought of bringing people into God's presence, and then worshiping, and then I know what my week has been like, and it's like marred with sin, there's a got into a fight with somebody on a basketball court, or I got angry with somebody, or I did something inappropriate, and I have to reconcile all of that while standing in front of people singing songs, and so the tension that you feel with feeling the weight of your sin, but also knowing that God is good and God is gracious, and then you're inviting people into the presence of God, it's tough. So I try to approach it with honesty, and try to be confessional, to remember that it's a serious thing. You're trying to usher people into the presence of God, and like in the Old Testament, before Christ came and tore the veil, you have the temple, and there's an innermost holy place where the high priest can go in once a year, and if they don't do it the correct way, then you literally get killed,
Right.
some serious business. So the idea of worship, even though now that God has through Christ tearing down the veil and then giving us free access. And now God resides inside of us. We are the temple, but there's something weighty about this thing, So yeah, like I do it because there's a sort of a necessity for it, but it's like one of those things, if somebody more gifted comes along, I'm definitely happy to, although we recently bought a bass guitar at our church, and I haven't touched the bass guitar in a long time, and it's been kind of fun actually. I play once in a while when Robert tells me to, and but I don't identify myself as like a worship leader, and I think that is actually probably not a good thing, because I think it is a serious thing, and if God calls you to do it, and it's like a priestly duty, so it's like something that I think I need to think on a little bit more. So yeah, it's just something that I've been wrestling with, but yeah, that's sort of how I think about it.
There's a lot of similarities in what you were talking about, especially when it came to that earnest characteristic that you brought up, which can, obviously be a positive thing, but in some ways it definitely can be a little bit negative if it's
burdensome.
Yeah. And when I was in the youth group and praise band and stuff like that, like just kind of like what you were saying earlier, it's like I didn't really know what I was doing. I was just like, hey, I get to play drums, like, praise God, awesome, but as after I came back, after I walked away from the church, and I had this really strong feeling of kind of like, what does it mean to be in the praise band? And when I first went back to church after service, I went up to the stage, and because I don't play drums anymore outside of church, because I don't have one. Well, I have one at home, mom and dad's place, but it's broken apart. So like I saw the electric drum set, and I was like, all right, I gotta play that for a second. So I played it, and then like that day, somebody came up to me. It was my first day ever going back to that church in I don't even know how many years, but they're like, hey, do you want to join praise band? And I was just kind of taken aback. I was like, whoa, what? Like so easily asking for just a random person to join the praise band. Sure. And I had kind of like I was a little taken aback in terms of, not like that I was like, why are you asking me? Like, but it's like at the same time, kind of like, why are you asking me? It's like, I'm not even truly a full member of the church yet. Like, you heard me play. Sure. Like, I get that I'm pretty decent at it and you're looking for a drummer, but kind of like what you went through with college. I don't think that the vetting thing is, necessarily needed. I think but at the same time, like, if that brought some value and God was able to use that, then that's a great thing. But,
yeah,
to me, it was really more on, there's certain levels of preparation that I felt that was required before you are like essentially worthy to be in the praise band. And I quickly kind of got away from that notion once I realized that every single person, regardless of, whether they are in the praise band or not, we're all sinners, it's just, yeah. But the reason why I really wanted to get into it and eventually started to, and even eventually kind of went into leading the worship sets, is that like when we believe in God, like we have to serve in some way or another, and whether that be being an usher, whether that just be with helping during fellowship with snacks, or
sure, like
we're called to serve not only like God, but we have to be of service to our own local community, like our church and our fellowships. Mm-hmm. And there are a lot of things that I still have a lot of work to do in that service aspect, but if I am going to serve in one way that I know I can serve well is within that, worship aspect. So yeah, I kind of took the notion of like, how deserving am I? But it also is a battle that I struggle with internally, because, I battle with pride so much. So it's that ultimately I love music, and there's this kind of, tension between I need to make sure I'm humble, and this is truly for the glory of God and nothing else.
Yeah.
And then there's a part of me where I'm like, man, I want to sound good. Like, you know what I mean? So it's just, I always have that tension. That's why, worship leading is so much more of a struggle for me when I'm like preparing, because I'm like, no, I can't just go into Sunday service without really feeling like I prepared for this. And yeah, I don't know. Like, I don't know if that makes sense. Like, yeah. But
no, yeah. I mean, I think like, there's different schools of thoughts on, what exactly is the role of like a worship team, worship band, like our church, or kind of playing with this idea of whether or not you really have to be a pastor or an elder to lead worship, because it is a very priestly duty. And, even on the worship team, like, I don't think I agree with this, but, it's like, should everybody be like a deacon, like someone who's ordained by the church to be able to lead worship? And so I don't think I necessarily agree with that, but the thought of asking these questions about worship team, I think is important. But, at the same time, I think it's important to remember that God is not creating some sort of like crazy Byzantine system, of all these orders of. In fact, he kind of did away with that, in the New Testament. So the thing that's kind of interesting about you, and you've been hugely encouraging me, just recently how much you've changed. And actually, Mom told me a story about you the other day that was a very, it made me choke up a little bit. But when you first started being on the praise team, I actually kind of like had those thoughts, because I think Mom was just happy that you were getting involved with church. But I was like, no, I don't know. I don't know if Shin was like, like, I don't know. I don't know if this guy's like, should be on the praise team, and it's a little odd. And maybe I was probably a little bit judgmental of like Pastor Steve, I'm like, man, this guy has like no standard, It's like, what's going on? But then like, like through like you being on the team, and then you getting to know the church, and you're getting involved, and like something kind of like miraculous happened, like after all the years of just being sort of, like wayward, like your this heart, and it just happened out of the blue, like and I gotta imagine that God used your interaction with your praise team, your interaction with Pastor Steve, and all the little to big moments over the past couple of years to kind of soften and make your heart be moldable, and so yeah, I think trying to think of ways to make the most of worship is very important. But I think maybe the point's not all about like how do we put a system around it that's inflexible. I think if the heart is at the core is really about like how do we structure ourselves so that we maximally glorify God. I think that's like a good pursuit. But maybe like the rest of the details not as important. And yeah, like maybe you just gotta get a little older, because I do think that over time, this idea of like performance is no longer like really something that I deeply struggle with, because maybe after getting married, I feel like I have no one else to impress, and and I think maybe one thing that could be a good characteristic is I don't think I take myself like too seriously, so I don't get embarrassed easily. I don't really get sort of too high or too low, like today I was playing the bass, and I dropped the bass guitar. Just the strap fell off, and then created this like big noise, and the guitar got detuned, and then all the volume knobs got messed up, and so I'm pretty sure I sounded like terrible. I was like,
Right.
who cares?
Yeah.
I try my best. But speaking of, I know we probably have to end the conversation soon, but one thing that I did want to tell you, Mom was talking about you, and was just talking about how, we don't have to get into details, but how things got a little bit elevated at home, a month or two ago, and then you stormed off, and whether you were 60% right, 40% wrong, doesn't really matter, but Mom felt like you had some legitimate reason to be upset, and then you stormed off, and then I heard that you came back, and you apologized, and it didn't soothe the situation, and you came back the next day, and you apologized, and then it didn't soothe the situation, and you came back the next day, and then you apologized, and I could just sense, that your heart is really just soft, for God, and I was just really encouraged, just really thankful, and so yeah, I'm just proud of you, and just proud of the journey that you're on, and I know it's not done yet, and there's gonna be more stuff, more stories that unfolds, but yeah, just you've been encouraging me a lot lately, so
yeah, I really appreciate that, man. Yeah, I mean, yeah, like you said, we don't need to get into the details of it, but this is ultimately like what this isn't something I can take credit for either, so this is why I say like all glory goes to God. Ultimately, like with the temper I have, it's just kind of like when I'm pissed off, I'm pissed off, and kind of like similar to the story about last night when I got angry with Jasmine, and I went downstairs, and then I'm like, all right, I'm gonna do my own thing. And if this was like a year ago, I wouldn't have come back up. I would have just stayed there and let her be mad at me. I would have been mad at her for no reason, but I would have just stayed mad at her.
Yeah.
And I would have thought I was right. And then like 3 days later, I'll be like, wait, maybe I was wrong, because I'm just coming to that conclusion all of a sudden. I'm like, maybe I'm just a really angry person. But in these situations, and I think this is one of the key points of why I want to have these conversations with people, and like to challenge and encourage people to really kind of live that Christ-driven life, is because this is what God does for you in every single situation in life. Like, whether it be, through how we handle personal situations in our family life,
sure,
or, but that day specifically, I left, and it was just more of, I had this kind of a feeling of, it's like, is this what, being a son is? Like, because ultimately, I have a lot of issues, that we don't have to get into all that, but like, I have a lot of issues sometimes, and like, there are things that I'm like, man, I wish I could say something and it would resonate, and it would actually go through. And maybe it's because of the language barrier. I'm not, it's mainly the conversations are all in Korean, and speak at like a 5th grade level. So some of the stuff that I want to say that have deeper meanings don't really go through. But at the same time, when you have God's message in your heart, it's like one of those things that says, honor your mother and father, and ultimately the big thing that hit me was, am I honoring like dad and mom in this time, regardless of whether I'm right or wrong?
Sure.
It's just about like, this is what God commanded me to do, and it's not my place to try to teach them. You know what I mean? They spent all their years teaching me, and like teaching them is maybe something that is within my role if God chooses it to be, but that's not going to come from me trying to like be wiser than them or something like that. It's just
right.
like I think the things that will help reach them is kind of how I feel like anybody is kind of made curious for God and Christ in general, is that out of all the testimonies I hear, it's not some argument for God that ultimately somebody is like, yeah, I want to learn about it. It's when they see somebody truly kind of living out what Christ tells us to do. And not saying anybody's perfect at it, but when you see somebody genuinely trying to do that and you see a different light to them, like that's why, God says, be the salt of the earth, be the light onto the earth, and that's what we need to do if we ultimately want to reach people. And we have to actually live in a way that Christ tells us to live, through that loving compassion. And I felt a really strong kind of need to go back that day. And also, like I through my own actions, I make their situation bad, because, if I leave badly, then they're going to argue about me, and then they're going to get into a stupid situation, and argue. And I'm like, just because of my intolerance and inability to control my temper, I'm now going to negatively affect the next like 2-3 days for them, and that was when I realized, I was like, this is not how I need to act, so yeah, I don't know, like it's hard to really pinpoint exactly what it is, but like this is where truly, like, I think if God wasn't in my heart at that moment, it would have just been like, I don't care, like I'm just gonna go home. This is how I feel. It's like they can deal with it on their own, but it's because like I had God, and I'm truly really trying to love God the way he told us to love him, and to love others the way he told us to love others. And that's what really made me change my mind in that moment. And ultimately God gave me that humility, so praise to him. But yeah, no, like so many different things I need to work on, like like I have so much to work on. Like I know that so many people like give me compliments about how they feel that my journey with God has been very good. I'm on the right path, but ultimately it's just the more closer I feel to God, the more I realize like I suck. Like I suck a lot, but God's good. Like he'll help me through it all. Like, and yeah, so it's just, it's a big tension. Like you start realizing how terrible you really are, but but then you're like, wait, that's doesn't matter. But yeah.
No, it's crazy. It's like the weight of your sin, but then like feeling like so loved. I think that's what keeps us going. And to your point earlier, this is like, I think like in 1 John, that no one's like seen God, but if we like love each other, God abides in us, and his love is perfected in us. So to your point, I think there's far more easy things that our hearts get persuaded by when it comes to trying to sort of push a thought through with logic or with words, with so many words, and it's like there's this part of us that believes like, if you just poke that one thing, inside of this person's head, that person's like whatever loose screw, is gonna be placed in correctly, and that all the stuff that's wrong with this particular person's like thoughts, will be like resolved, and I think that's why, like there's such tendency of talking past each other, like I do that all the time, and I'm like, this sentence right here, this is like the golden sentence that's gonna unlock every issue, that this person has ever experienced, and I have that with like mom a lot, so, I don't feel comfortable sometimes confronting dad as much as you do, but with mom a little bit more comfortable, and then it's like every single time I get upset, every time I get upset at someone else, or like June, or and this is the same thing like towards me, when people have legitimate things to be upset about with me, and they often do, because I am just covered with imperfection, but it's not the words, but it's like when you feel like just, like you can see the love, that you feel just like all the stuff kind of melt away, and so yeah, I'm just really encouraged that you are displaying that in your interaction, and particularly with mom and dad, and obviously they love you to the moon, and and that, and yeah, so we shall see, but I'm optimistic that 30, 40, 50 years from now, then we'll have even more of these conversations, and we'll be like, yeah, I remember when we're like 30 something and we thought we knew some stuff, and man, like we didn't know anything, but man, God was good, and that's really the hope, to stay humble, to stay hungry, to stay needy for Him, and to call out to Him when we encounter stuff, and like we obviously recently went through some stuff, with Dad's cancer, and just feeling helpless, but God has been really faithful, and even now I just have to like remember that, like with all the aftermath of the chemo, with just like mom and dad getting older and feeling weaker, and my mind's like constantly spinning with like 10,000 problems, and like, and as you know, like when June's dad passed away, it was like 6 months before, when Dad got kind of diagnosed with cancer. It was just like my mind was like spinning and spinning and spinning, and it still does, because I have so many fears about so many things, and I feel like I have to hold everything together, to not break apart, and like there's just a lot of days, when I feel just exhausted and overwhelmed and bitter and tired and angry, and just in that moment, like just a thought comes in. It's like God's like, He's faithful, He's been a good father, perfect father. He's got us through so many things, like I mean, just in our short time in Virginia, like mom's been through cancer, heart surgery, dad's been through cancer, like all the seemingly big troubles at the time, like when we look back now, it's like life is not like easy, we're not on some easy street, by any stretch of imagination, but man, He's been so faithful, so
yeah, no,
yeah,
absolutely. And I mean, yeah, it's just like all those stuff, and don't forget, like when you were in college, you went through something, with your spinal tumor and stuff like that. So it's just, a lot of stuff, like, you look back and, you know, it's, yeah, like, God's really been there for us in so many different ways. And a lot of different families that have gone through this, but had, you know, much different results as, you know, as the outcome. And, God's just been really faithful to us. So I praise him for it. But, you know, ultimately, yeah, like you said, I think it's really important for us to just continue this walk with as much faith as possible. And, you know, like, there's a lot of things that we can reason with, but at the same time, like, just the basic aspect of, like, what, you know, and even in, like, the Reformed epistemological aspect of, you don't necessarily need some sort of defense to be justified in believing in God. And I think that's really true, because there's so many things where, you know, like, if you had to explain some of the things that God has done for you, like, in a reasonable, logical way, like, you sound crazy, you know what I mean? Like, the amount of comfort that he's given to me in certain situations when some of those things were happening with Dad, with Mom. I was a little young when you went through your stuff, but I do remember the power of what that situation put our family in, and, like, through God, like, where we were coming together and praying in a way that we never did before. And
Sure.
I feel like God uses so many of those times, like we were talking about earlier with the struggles. Like, it's a sense of unity that he can give to so many different people, and in a way that is meaningful and can bless us if we allow him to. But yeah, dude, like, this has been, like, such an amazing conversation, man. Like, I'm really happy that you came on the show. Hopefully, you know, we can continue to have discussions like this. I know we went over a little bit past, so
it's all good.
Yeah.
I think you mentioned that you wanted to, like, encourage people. So if I can just share one thing. This was hanging in the guest bedroom, I think, in my father-in-law's house. You know, I never saw it until, like, you know, after he passed away, and, you know, we went for a funeral and were there for, like, a week or so. And it's just like a passage from 2 Corinthians chapter 6. And the whole chapter is really about, like, just kind of like calling for, I think, you know, sort of remaining in your faith, you know, and a call to Christians to be steadfast and to endure. But there's this one part that he had framed, and kind of like, I guess, Korean people call it, like, kahun, I think, you know, maybe butchering it, but kind of like almost a family, you know, life kind of like, you know, verse. And it reads in ESV as sorrowful, yet always rejoicing, as poor, yet making many rich, as having nothing, yet possessing everything. And I think for people who, I don't know how many audiences you have, but whoever's going to be listening, you know, whether it's one person, i.e. mom, or two people, i.e. mom and dad, or, you know, millions of people potentially, like, you know, I think that's the promise of God, you know, that, you know, beyond our understanding and beyond, like you said, logic, that even in sorrowful situations, we can rejoice. Even if we're poor, we are rich. And even if we have nothing, we have everything, because, you know, we have God. And that's not some sort of you know, platitude to, you know, accept mediocrity, or, you know, to be content with, you know, just being miserable. It's like a state of a new heart, you know, that we really can be joyful through everything, you know, joyful through everything. And I think, like, yeah, it's like a worthy thing to keep in mind, you know, to pursue after. And I think it's a promise that's worth chasing after. And that we're not defined by the things of this world, as tempting as they are, and that we're not defined by our day-to-day actions or day-to-day goals or how much things we have accumulated in this life, or how others may think of us, but that we live for others, and that outward pouring out, is what defines our legacy beyond this life, and in perpetuity, forever, into eternity. And so, yeah, I hope this podcast, repurposing of your podcast, brings a lot of joy and a lot of blessing to your audience, and hopefully there will be many better guests in the future, because the first one is not the best, it's the weakest one, so there will be many more good ones to come. So
I don't believe that at all. No, I found so much value in this conversation, and we don't talk like a lot, you know what I mean? So it's not like we talk
I'm
every
yelling at you
single
most
day.
of the times, so.
not these years, but but like it's one thing if we talk like all the time as siblings, like every day we're talking to each other, and then like you come on the podcast and we're like, all right, let's talk about God today. It's we really don't talk that much. You're really busy with your work. I just suck at calling, but it's mainly it's like we talk once in a blue moon, maybe a little bit more than that, but we talk when we need to, when it's needed to. When we need to, but ultimately it's just amazing how, like, after all the differences that we've been through in our life together, when I was growing up, and just even the age gap, and I was super nervous about how the interview would go and everything. So, but
it's good. I enjoyed it.
It's been amazing. Like I learned a lot on stuff that I feel like we've never really shared together like extensively in the past.
Sure.
So it's kind of crazy that it happens on a recording like this. It's like this felt like such a personal conversation in a lot of different ways. But
only for you, man. I don't do stuff like this, so.
I appreciate it. But yeah, thank you once again for coming onto the show. And yeah, like this podcast like really is to encourage to people to just really live for Christ, but ultimately like the goal is not like it was with my previous podcast. It's just I had a goal where it was like I want a lot of people on this. I want a lot of people to listen to this, and I want to eventually make some money from it. But ultimately, like I had a certain realization that I wanted to do everything I could with my talents. And this is something that I feel like I have a talent for doing. And yeah, it's just, if any single one person can be encouraged by this, then I feel like I've done my job. But ultimately, I'm leaving it to God. And if he wants to use his podcast to reach people, then I know he will. And if it's not within his purpose, then this will fail really miserably, and I'm completely okay with that. But ultimately it's like, yeah, like the conversations that I've been having with people, personally, and looking forward to the interviews that come in the future. But yeah, I think it's really just about, hey, let's talk about God. Let's like really challenge each other, like not in doctrinal way or anything like that, but like, hey, how are we living for him? Like, are we applying his actual message into our daily life? And when we dive into these conversations, I think it'll be really meaningful, and I pray that it'll actually be meaningful to others. So yeah, but yeah, thank you again for coming on the show, and yeah, it's been awesome.
Likewise, my friend.